My husband bled my last chance at motherhood into a hotel toilet while I held the bowl, and he made sure I wrote it down. I was 25 years old. The baby was 12 weeks, far enough that I'd felt the first flutter, the secret language of a body making room for someone new. I'd named her in my head. Lily, after the flowers that grew wild behind my grandmother's house in Louisiana, the only place I'd ever felt safe. The only place where the air smelled like jasmine and freedom, where my grandmother would brush my hair on the porch swing and tell me I was made of the same stubborn clay as the Mississippi River. Clayton found the prenatal vitamins in my bathroom drawer. I had hidden them behind a box of tampons, wrapped in a silk scarf I'd stolen from a charity auction, thinking that the layers would buy me time. I was wrong. He never missed anything. He had the instincts of a predator who'd spent his entire life learning the scent of weakness in others. He didn't shout. He never shouted. Shouting was for men who couldn't control their wives, for men who lacked the discipline to make fear feel like a choice. Clayton was a United States Senator from Texas, and he controlled everything: the temperature of the house, the color of my nail polish, the cadence of my laughter at campaign events, the angle at which I tilted my head for photographs. "Sit," he said. His voice was the same one he used on the Senate floor, measured, warm, the voice of a man who could make you agree to your own destruction if he smiled while he said it. I sat. The chair was hard oak, antique, imported from some estate sale in Virginia. Everything in our house was imported, curated, chosen to project a specific image of American prosperity and traditional values. The chair dug into my thighs. I would have bruises later, small ones, the kind that don't show in photographs. He stood over me in his charcoal suit, the one with the Texas flag pin on the lapel, the one that meant he was about to explain why my pain was necessary. The pin caught the afternoon light from the window. I'd always hated that pin. It was too shiny, too eager, like a badge of honor earned by simply being born in the right place. An election year iris. He said my name the way he said everything, as if he was tasting it, deciding if it was still worth keeping. You know what the polls say about family values. A pregnant wife at 4 to 5, they'll say I'm old. They'll say I'm desperate. They'll say I can't keep my house in order. He smiled. The smile that had won him 3 terms, that had convinced voters he was the kind of man you could trust with your daughters and your tax dollars and your prayers. It was a smile that reached his eyes but never touched anything behind them. "We can't have that," he said. He drove me to the clinic himself. That was part of the ritual, the performance of care that made the violence feel like medicine. He held my hand in the waiting room like a devoted husband, his thumb tracing circles on my palm, while we sat beneath fluorescent lights that hummed like trapped insects. He'd chosen the clinic carefully, not the one downtown where someone might recognize us, but a private practice in a medical complex off the highway, the kind of place where wealthy women went for discreet procedures, and no one asked questions about last names. He signed the forms with his left hand, a trick he'd learned years ago. His signature was illegible either way. He'd spent decades perfecting a scrawl that could be denied, disavowed, explained away. But the left hand added an extra layer of distance, a small act of cowardice that he probably found clever. "I'll wait outside," he said, squeezing my shoulder. The squeeze was too hard. A warning dressed as affection. "You do what needs to be done." I didn't look at him. I couldn't. If I looked at him, I might scream, and screaming in public was not something Senator Clayton Whitfield's wife did. I walked down the hallway in shoes he'd chosen, wearing a dress he'd approved, carrying a purse that matched the color scheme of our living room. I was a set piece in the theater of his life, and the show had to go on. The procedure took 20 minutes. They gave me something for the pain, but not enough. I think that was intentional. I think Clayton had made arrangements. I think he wanted me to feel it, to carry the memory in my body as clearly as I carried it in my mind. When it was over, I lay on a paper-covered table and stared at a ceiling tile that had a small water stain in the corner. The stain looked like a map of a country I'd never visited. I named it Lilyland. I gave it rivers and mountains and cities where women could have babies without permission. Clayton took me to a hotel afterward. Not our home. Our home was for public consumption, for dinner parties and strategy sessions and the illusion of normalcy. The hotel was for adjustments. He'd been using the same one for years, a boutique place near the Capitol with a doorman who didn't make eye contact and a concierge who understood that some guests required absolute discretion. He made me shower. He stood outside the bathroom door while the water ran too hot, scalding my skin, washing away the blood and the evidence, and he probably hoped, some of my rebellion. He made me eat room service, something beige and expensive that tasted like nothing. Watched me take every bite, counting my swallows, making sure I understood that even my hunger belonged to him. Then he made me write the date in the calendar he kept on the kitchen wall. The calendar was his invention, a tool of control disguised as domestic organization. It hung in the kitchen of our Georgetown townhouse, a large wall calendar with photographs of Texas landscapes, bluebonnets in spring, hill country in summer, the Alamo in winter. Every day had a box, and every box had to be filled. Appointments, campaign events, social obligations, my weight, my caloric intake, my moods. He reviewed it each morning with his coffee, running his finger down the columns, checking for deviations. March 14th, he said, watching me print the letters. His breath smelled of bourbon and peppermint. He was always careful about his breath. A for adjustment, that's what we'll call it. Adjustments. I wrote A. The pen was heavy in my hand. I wanted to stab him with it, to drive the ballpoint into his throat and watch the surprise in his eyes. Instead, I wrote A, small, neat. The handwriting of a woman who had learned that survival sometimes meant performing submission so perfectly that even you started to believe it. I didn't cry. I'd learned not to cry. Crying made him creative. That was the third one. The first had been at 28, when a donor's wife saw me buying maternity clothes at a department store in Dallas. I'd been careful, a store across town, a time when I thought Clayton was in committee, but the donor's wife had sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She'd called Clayton that evening, not to threaten exactly, but to express concern about appearances and family values. The funding dried up within a week. Not all of it, Clayton was too careful for that, but enough that he noticed. Enough that he came home one night and didn't speak for 3 hours, just sat in his leather chair and stared at me with an expression that was worse than anger. It was calculation. He was deciding the cost of keeping me. The baby had been a boy I'd only known for 2 days. I'd started a nursery in my head, pale blue walls, a mobile with stars, a name I whispered in the shower where the water masked my voice. Thomas. After my father, who died when I was 12 and left a hole in the world that I'd been trying to fill ever since. Clayton didn't drive me to the clinic that time. He sent a car, a black sedan with tinted windows and a driver who didn't speak. I sat in the back and watched Dallas pass by through dark glass, the city looking like a place I'd never lived, a movie set where someone else was playing my life. I wrote T in the calendar that night. T for Thomas. T for taken. T for the tomb I was building inside myself, one letter at a time. The second abortion was at 3 to 4, when Clayton was being vetted for a committee chairmanship. The Senate Majority Leader had called him into his office for a friendly chat about optics, about the importance of projecting stability, about how a pregnant senator's wife sends the wrong message about focus and discipline. It's not forever, Clayton had told me that night, lying in bed with his back to me, his voice floating across the darkness like a promise he had no intention of keeping. After the chairmanship, after the next term, we'll have children then, when the timing is right. I knew he was lying, I'd always known. But I let myself believe it for 3 weeks because believing it was the only way I could get out of bed in the morning. The baby was 8 weeks. I hadn't named her yet. I was waiting, I told myself, until I was sure, until Clayton was sure, until the world was kind enough to let me keep something that was mine. They scraped her from my body on a Tuesday. I remember it was Tuesday because the clinic played soft jazz in the waiting room, and the song was The Girl from Ipanema, and I spent the next 10 years unable to hear that melody without feeling like I was falling down a well with no bottom. Each time, the calendar got a new letter. Each time, I wrote it in the code I'd invented, the code he thought was submission but was actually evidence. I'd started the code in the first year of our marriage, when I realized that Clayton would read everything I wrote, would search my journals and my emails, and the margins of my books for signs of disobedience. So I created a language he wouldn't understand, a system of notation that looked like the mundane record-keeping of a dutiful wife, but was actually a ledger of crimes. C. For the days he weighed me every morning at 6 a.m., before coffee, before water, while I stood naked on a scale in the bathroom, and he recorded the number in a leather notebook he kept in his desk. For the days I ate less than 1,000 calories to keep the number he wanted, to maintain the silhouette that looked good beside him in photographs. C for control. C for the cage he'd built around my appetite, my body, my sense of self. V. For the days his belt came off. Not the buckle, he wasn't a brute, he would say he was a gentleman. The flat side. The way he'd learned in law school, he once told me with something like pride, to inflict maximum pain without leaving marks that would show at a fundraiser. V for violence. V for the nights I lay on the bathroom floor and listened to the blood rush in my ears, counting the tiles on the ceiling until the room stopped spinning. S. For the days I smiled at cameras, at donors, at his mistresses, while my inside screamed. S for the performances at campaign rallies, where I stood behind him and clapped at the right moments, where I shook hands and kissed babies, and pretended that my marriage was the kind of partnership that voters could aspire to. S for the Sunday church services, where where I sat in the front pew and sang hymns with a voice that sounded like devotion, but was actually the practiced pitch of a woman who had learned that God helps those who help themselves. And I was on my own, and for the days I hated him enough to plan his death. The tickets got more frequent in the last 5 years, after the third abortion. After I turned 40 and he started bringing women home, not to our bed, he wasn't crude, but to the guest house where I could see them from my bedroom window, where he made sure I knew that my replacement was already auditioning. The first one was a legislative aide, 23, with a laugh like wind chimes and a future that would be over before she understood what had happened to it. I watched her through the curtains, watched Clayton pour her wine in the guest house kitchen, watched his hand on her lower back, watched her face light up with the same hope I'd once felt. I wrote her name in the calendar, Melissa, with a phone number I'd memorized from Clayton's cell phone while he showered. I wrote L that night, then another L, then a third. Then came the donors' wives, the interns, the lobbyists, the women who passed through our lives like weather systems, leaving damage in their wake that they would spend years trying to understand. I learned their names. I learned their patterns. I learned which ones he cared about and which ones were disposable, which ones got jewelry and which ones got threats. I had no bank account. He'd closed my personal accounts in the first year of our marriage, explaining that it was simpler to have everything under his management, that a senator's wife didn't need to worry about mundane details. I had no driver's license. He'd misplaced it during a move and never replaced it, explaining that I didn't need to drive, that we had staff for that it was safer for me to be driven everywhere. No friends he hadn't approved, no family he hadn't vetted, no connections that didn't serve his narrative. I was a senator's wife, which meant I was a prop, a backdrop, a smile in the right dress at the right angle. I left the house twice a month, church, where I sat in the front pew and prayed to a God who never answered, and the grocery store, where I bought the food he approved and nothing else. The grocery store was my only freedom, 4 to 5 minutes in fluorescent-lit aisles where I could walk without being watched, where I could touch, produce, and read labels and pretend I was choosing something. I wasn't. Of course, Clayton gave me a list, and deviations were noted, questioned, punished. But for those 4 to 5 minutes, I could walk among strangers and imagine what it would be like to be one of them. But I had the calendars. Not one, hundreds. 20 years of wall calendars from the church Clayton pretended to frequent, each day annotated in my cramped handwriting. The church ladies thought I was pious, keeping track of prayer requests and Bible verses. Clayton thought I was obedient, documenting my compliance. Neither of them understood that I was building a case. The C-tickets and V-tickets and A's and S-tickets. The names of the women, the interns, the donors, the wives of colleagues, written in the margins with phone numbers I'd memorized from his speed dial, addresses from receipts I pulled from his suit pockets while I laundered them. I knew which hotels he used, the Four Seasons for the ones he wanted to impress, a Motel 6 off I-35 for the ones he didn't, a boutique place in Austin for the ones who thought they were special. I knew which credit cards paid for which rooms, the campaign card for constituent meetings, the personal card for marriage counseling, the shell company card for the ones who required NDAs. I knew which days he visited which woman. I knew because I was invisible, and invisible women see everything. I knew because I'd spent 2 decades learning to be furniture, to be wallpaper, to be the thing in the room that no one notices until they need a coaster or a prop for a photograph. I knew because I'd turned invisibility into a superpower, because I'd learned that the only advantage of being unseen was that you could see everything. I also knew the land. Clayton loved to hunt. Quail mostly, though he'd shot a deer once and made me pose with the carcass for a campaign photo that ran in 3 newspapers. Senator Whitfield, a man of the people, a steward of the land. I'd smiled beside that dead animal, my hand on its cooling flank while Clayton talked to the photographer about lighting and angles. The deer had soft eyes. I thought about those eyes for months. He had a lease on 300 acres outside Dallas, rough terrain, thick brush, a place where accidents happened, where a man could trip, could fall, could find his own shotgun pointed at his chest in a moment of clumsy enthusiasm. The land was beautiful in a harsh way, limestone ridges, cedar breaks, creeks that ran dry in August and flooded in April. Clayton loved it because it made him feel rugged, because it connected him to some frontier mythology he believed about himself. I started planning 3 years before he died. It wasn't a decision I made all at once. It was a series of small choices, each one so minor that I could pretend I wasn't heading anywhere in particular. I volunteered to scout for his hunting trips, a wifely duty, he thought, a chance for me to be useful to earn my keep. He liked the idea of me walking the land, checking the blinds, reporting back on bird activity. It made him feel like we were a team. I walked every ridge, every gully, every blind spot. I went in different seasons, in different weathers, learning how the ground changed when it was wet, how the brush thickened after rain, how the shadows fell at different times of day. I noted where the ground was uneven, where a man could lose his footing, where the brush was thick enough to hide a body until someone thought to look. There was a particular spot on the eastern ridge, near a stand of live oaks that Clayton liked because the birds flew low there. The ground sloped at an angle that was just steep enough to be treacherous, covered with loose limestone gravel that shifted underfoot. A live oak had fallen years ago, its roots exposed in a tangle that looked like a giant's hand reaching from the earth. I spent weeks clearing brush in that area, removing obstacles that might prevent a fall, exposing the root system further, making the ground more unstable without making it look disturbed. I practiced at night, in the dark, walking the route with my eyes closed, counting steps, memorizing the feel of the earth. I learned how long it took to get from the truck to the ridge, how long to get back, where the shadows would be at 10 a.m. on a November morning. I selected the witnesses carefully. Two of Clayton's donors, men in their 70s with cataracts and egos too large to admit they couldn't see past 20 yards. Harold Jennings, who'd made his fortune in oil and thought that money had improved his eyesight along with his bank account. Richard Cole, a real estate developer who wore glasses thick as Coke bottles but refused to admit he needed them. Both men were desperate for Clayton's approval, for the access and influence that came with being in a senator's circle. They would see what they were told to see. The guide was a man named Joe Castellano, a local who'd worked the lease for years. I'd paid him in cash, my only money, scraped from grocery budgets over years, hidden in a tampon box in the back of my closet. It wasn't much, a few $100s, but it was enough to buy his silence about a few adjustments to the hunting plan. I told him I wanted to surprise Clayton with a special setup, a new blind on the eastern ridge that I'd scouted myself. I told him it was an anniversary gift. Joe didn't care. Joe cared about cash and keeping his job. I organized the day with the efficiency of a woman who had nothing else to do. I packed the cooler, sandwiches, water, the expensive bourbon Clayton liked to drink while he hunted. I loaded the guns, checking each shell, making sure the shotgun was clean and ready. I laid out the schedule, the route, the timing. I was the perfect hostess, the perfect wife, the perfect accessory to a senator's morning of masculine recreation. Clayton died on November 3rd. The sky was the color of old pewter low clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. The air smelled of cedar and dust, and the particular silence that comes before violence. We drove to the ridge in Clayton's truck, the four of us crammed in the cab with the guns rattling in the rack behind us. Harold talked about the stock market. Richard complained about his prostate. Clayton sat in the passenger seat with his window down, breathing the air like a man who owned it. I drove. I always drove. It was one of the few things Clayton allowed me to do because it made him feel magnanimous, because it fit the image of the down-to-earth senator who didn't need a chauffeur. I parked where I always parked, at the base of the eastern ridge. The walk to the hunting blind was 300 yards up the slope through the live oaks. I carried the cooler. Clayton carried his shotgun. The donors carried their egos. Joe Castellano was already at the blind, positioned on the wrong side of the ridge as we'd arranged, far enough away that he could claim he saw nothing, close enough that his presence would be noted in any investigation. I walked behind Clayton, watching his boots on the gravel. I knew every step of this path. I'd walked it 100 times. I knew exactly where the ground began to shift, exactly where the exposed roots waited, exactly where a man's balance could be lost with the slightest encouragement. It happened near the top of the ridge, where the slope was steepest and the gravel was loosest. Clayton was talking about something, a bill, a vote, a rival who needed to be handled. He was always talking, always performing, even when there was no audience but the birds and the wind. I didn't push him. I want to be clear about that. I never touched him. What I did was simpler and more elegant. I stopped walking. I stopped right at the edge of the unstable ground, and my sudden stillness made him turn. He turned too quickly, his weight shifting, his boots sliding on the gravel. He reached for a branch that wasn't there. I'd removed it 3 weeks ago, and his momentum carried him backward. He fell. It looked like a trip. It looked like clumsiness, like a man who'd been drinking, who'd been reckless, who'd made a fatal error on terrain he'd hunted 100 times. His shotgun, which I'd loaded myself that morning, discharged as he fell. The safety was off. I'd checked it 3 times. The buckshot took him in the chest at close range. The sound was enormous, a crack that echoed off the limestone and sent birds exploding from the trees in a black cloud of wings. The witnesses saw what I needed them to see. Harold Jennings, squinting through his cataracts, saw a man trip. Richard Cole, peering through glasses that needed updating, saw an accident. Joe Castellano, positioned on the wrong side of the ridge, heard the shot and came running, playing his part with the enthusiasm of a man who'd been paid to be surprised. I screamed. I'd practiced the scream too, in the shower in the car, making sure it sounded right, high, panicked, the scream of a devoted wife who just watched her husband die. I ran to him, falling to my knees in the gravel, getting his blood on my hands, my face, my clothes. I pressed my hands to his chest as if I could stop the bleeding, as if I wanted to. I looked into his eyes as the light left them, and I saw something there that might have been surprise, might have been recognition, might have been the dawning understanding that he'd taught me too well. He died looking at me. I like to think he understood in that final moment that the invisible woman had finally made herself seen. I wrote V in the calendar that night. Then I crossed it out. Then I wrote L. Then I burned the page in the kitchen sink and watched the ash circle the drain, gray flakes of a life I was finally done pretending to live. The sheriff was a man Clayton had put in office with campaign funds, a good old boy named Buddy Henshaw who'd been to our house for barbecues and fundraisers, and the kind of parties where men talked about women like they were discussing livestock. Buddy arrived within an hour, his cruiser kicking up dust on the ranch road, his face already set in the expression of a man who'd been told what conclusion to reach. He interviewed the witnesses first. Harold and Richard, shaken but certain, tragic, just tragic. Buddy, the man was a legend, a true Texas legend. Joe Castellano, nervous but consistent, accident, sheriff, plain and simple. I seen it happen before, experienced hunters get careless, it's the confidence that kills ya. Then he interviewed me. I was sitting on the tailgate of Clayton's truck, wrapped in a blanket someone had found, shivering with a performance of shock that I'd rehearsed in my mind 1,000 times. My hands were still stained with Clayton's blood. I'd made sure not to wash them. The blood was evidence of my grief, of my devotion, of my innocence. Iris, honey, Buddy said, sitting beside me on the tailgate. He smelled of chewing tobacco and aftershave. I know this is hard, but I need you to tell me what happened. I told him about the walk, about the ridge, about Clayton's excitement, about his foot catching on something, a root maybe, or a rock, I couldn't be sure. Everything happened so fast. I told him about the shotgun, about the sound, about the way Clayton had looked at me before he died. I cried. Real tears too. I was surprised by them. I thought I'd used up all my tears years ago, but they came anyway, tears for the babies, tears for the years, tears for the woman I'd been and the woman I'd had to become. Buddy patted my shoulder. There, Iris, it's gonna be okay. Accidents happen, especially with experienced hunters. They get overconfident, we've all seen it. He closed the case in 48 hours. Tragic accident, the report said. Experienced hunter, unfortunate terrain, alcohol a possible factor. Clayton had been drinking the bourbon, after all, and I'd made sure to mention that to emphasize it, plant the seed that would grow into the official narrative. I wore black to the funeral. A dress I'd worn to 3 of Clayton's victory parties, recycled because I knew the cameras would recognize it, would see a grieving wife too devastated to shop for something new. I smiled for the cameras, not too much, just enough to show strength in sorrow. I accepted condolences from men who'd known exactly what Clayton was and had helped him anyway. Senators, congressmen, governors, donors, lobbyists, they came in waves, shaking my hand, patting my back, offering help that they didn't mean and I didn't need. The funeral was a state occasion. The governor spoke. The majority leader spoke. A televangelist who'd endorsed Clayton in 3 elections gave a eulogy about a great man of faith that made me want to laugh and scream at the same time. I sat in the front pew of the National Cathedral, listening to lies about my husband's character, his devotion, his love for his family, and I thought about the calendars in my storage unit, the evidence of who he really was, the proof that would never see a courtroom. And then Meyer appeared. She was 22, with Clayton's jaw and her mother's eyes dark, watchful, the eyes of someone who'd learned early that the world was not safe. She found me at the reception, standing by the shrimp platter in the dress I'd worn to 3 of Clayton's victory parties, holding a glass of wine I hadn't touched. The reception was at the Willard Hotel, one of Clayton's favorites, a place where power brokered itself over canapés and cocktails. The room was full of people who wanted to be seen mourning, who understood that grief was another form of networking. I was standing near a window, watching the rain start to fall on Pennsylvania Avenue, when I felt someone behind me. "You're Iris," she said, not a question. A statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone who'd spent her life verifying identities. I turned, and I saw Clayton. Not all of him, thank God, not all of him, but enough. The jawline stubborn and sharp. The height, the posture, the way she held herself like she was waiting for someone to tell her to sit down. But the eyes were different. The eyes were her mother's. I'd seen a photograph once, years ago, in Clayton's desk drawer. Patricia Vance, 24, standing on a porch in Louisiana, holding a baby and looking at the camera with an expression that was part defiance, part exhaustion, part hope that hadn't died yet. I said. I'm Maya. She stopped, swallowed. The gesture was young, vulnerable, the kind of hesitation that Clayton would have trained out of her if he'd raised her. I'm his daughter, the one he paid to disappear. I didn't flinch. I'd spent 20 years not flinching, not reacting, not giving anything away. But inside something shifted, a door opening, a light turning on in a room that had been dark for decades. I know who you are. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. I've known for 15 years. Your mother was Patricia Vance, Louisiana. She died of cancer 2 years ago. He sent flowers, white lilies. He never knew they were her favorite. Maya's eyes widened, then narrowed. The watchfulness returned. The defensive posture of someone who'd learned that information was currency and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. How did you? I was his wife. I set down my wine. The glass was sweating, condensation pooling on the tablecloth. Invisible women see everything. Come with me. I took her to the house. Not the mansion. I'd sold that within a month of Clayton's death. Couldn't stand to walk those halls anymore. Couldn't sleep in a bed that had never been mine. I'd bought a cottage in Austin with cash, the first financial decision I'd made in 2 decades. It was small, 2 bedrooms, a porch that faced west so I could watch the sunset over the hill country. It had a garden where I grew tomatoes and basil, and the lilies I'd planted in memory of all the children I'd never held. I took her to the storage unit where I kept the boxes. The calendars. 20 years of them, stacked in chronological order. Each one a ledger of cruelty, each page a crime scene no court would recognize. The unit was climate-controlled, paid for with cash from the grocery money I'd saved over years. I'd rented it under a false name, paid 5 years in advance, told the manager I was storing family heirlooms while I traveled. Maya didn't react like I expected. She didn't call the police. She didn't recoil in horror or tell me I was crazy. She opened the first box, read the first calendar, and started to cry. Not for me, for herself. For the father who'd known she existed and had written checks to keep her away, checks that had arrived monthly, like a subscription to silence, until Patricia's death, when they'd stopped as suddenly as they'd started. For the mother who'd died believing she was protecting Maya by staying silent, by taking the money, by telling herself that a check was better than nothing. I have something too, Maya said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. The gesture was so young, so unpracticed, that I felt something crack in my chest. A wall I'd built so long ago that I'd forgotten it was there. I'm a programmer, security. I've spent 2 years hacking his systems, not to hurt him, to understand him, to know why. She pulled out a laptop from her backpack, a sleek machine covered in stickers for open-source projects and cybersecurity conferences. She opened it on the floor of the storage unit, surrounded by boxes of calendars, and showed me a world I'd only glimpsed through receipts and phone numbers. Emails, hundreds of them, to women about women, arranging meetings, covering tracks, paying hush money. The language was clinical, transactional, the voice of a man who viewed human connection as a series of negotiations. Need to discuss the arrangement. Funds have been transferred. Recommend discretion going forward. Each email was a small murder, a reduction of intimacy to commerce. Bank records. Shell companies with names like Lone Star Consulting and Heritage Foundation Holdings, not the real Heritage Foundation, but close enough to confuse anyone who wasn't looking closely. Campaign funds diverted to apartments in Georgetown and Dallas and Miami. Abortions paid for with checks that could be traced back to constituent services. Silence purchased by the quarter, by the year, by the lifetime, and the spreadsheet. 37 names. 37 women Clayton had damaged with dates, locations, amounts paid, outcomes noted in cold columns. Some of the names I recognized from my calendars: Melissa, the legislative aide. Carol, the donor's wife who'd expressed concern about my pregnancy. Linda, a journalist who'd asked too many questions and been paid to ask no more. Most I didn't. Women I'd never met, never seen, never known existed. Women who'd believed they were alone, who'd thought their pain was singular, who'd never known that they were part of a pattern so large it spanned decades and states and lives. I was going to leak it, Maya said, her voice hollow with the exhaustion of someone who'd carried a burden too long. Anonymous, destroy him. But then he died, and I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if destroying a dead man helped anyone. I looked at her, this stranger with my husband's bones and her mother's grief, this child who'd grown up in the shadow of the same monster, who'd learned to be invisible in a different way, through code and encryption and the digital equivalent of my calendars. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 20 years. Not love. Love was too dangerous, too easily weaponized. But possibility. The possibility that the evidence I'd collected in isolation might mean something if it was shared. The possibility that two invisible women together might become visible in a way that one alone never could. "We don't leak it," I said. The words came out slowly, forming themselves as I spoke, a plan taking shape from 2 decades of dreaming. "We don't destroy him, he's already dead. We build something else." We spent 6 months in my cottage, Meyer and I, 2 women who'd never been allowed to be family, learning to occupy the same space without flinching. The first week was the hardest. We'd never been in a room together for more than an hour, and now we were sharing a bathroom, a kitchen, a silence that was sometimes comfortable and sometimes heavy with everything we weren't saying. She taught me about encryption, about dead man switches, about servers that only activate if 2 people stop checking in. She explained Tor networks and blockchain storage with the patience of someone who'd learned that knowledge was the only power that couldn't be taken away. I sat at her laptop for hours, my fingers clumsy on the keyboard, learning a new language that felt like the spiritual descendant of my calendar code, a way of hiding truth in plain sight, of making the invisible visible only to those who knew how to look. I taught her about documentation, how to turn survival into evidence, how to make the invisible visible on paper. I showed her my calendars, explained the code, demonstrated how 20 years of cramped handwriting could become a narrative more powerful than any confession. I taught her about patience, about the long game, about the discipline of recording everything and revealing nothing until the moment was right. Together, we built the archive. It wasn't a leak, wasn't blackmail. It was an insurance policy, a distributed, encrypted database containing my calendars, her hacks, the 37 names, and the names of the men who'd protected Clayton, donors, colleagues, police, journalists, each one with enough evidence to end careers if the archive ever went public. We spent weeks verifying, cross-referencing, building a structure so solid that no denial could stand against it. The files were stored on servers across 6 countries, protected by a dead man's switch that required both of us to confirm our existence every week. If one of us stopped, the other had 48 hours to reactivate. If both stopped, the archive published automatically to news outlets, to law enforcement, to the social media accounts of every person named in the files. It was a bomb that would only detonate if we were silenced, a promise that our deaths would be louder than our lives had been. Then we started calling. Not all 37. Some had moved on, changed names, built lives they didn't want to disturb. Some were dead by their own hands, by overdose, by the kind of accident that happens to women who know too much. We found obituaries, newspaper clippings, social media memorials. We said their names aloud in my cottage, lit candles for them, added their stories to the archive as testimony to the cost of Clayton's appetite. But we found 19 women who answered the phone, who listened to our proposal, who understood what it meant to have proof of your own erasure. Some hung up at first, thinking it was a trap, a joke, a cruel extension of Clayton's manipulation. Some called back. Some didn't, and we respected their silence. We didn't offer revenge. Revenge was a fire that consumed the arsonist along with the target. We offered infrastructure, therapy, paid for through a network of counselors who understood trauma without needing to know its source. Legal counsel, on retainer, ready to act if any of the men in the archive tried to silence their past. A network of women who'd document their own calendars, who'd learn the codes, who'd never be invisible again. The archive was their collective insurance. As long as it existed, the men who'd protected Clayton knew that any future harm against any of us would trigger the release. It was a standoff, a Cold War fought in encrypted files and anonymous servers, a balance of terror that kept us all safe. Iris didn't go to prison. The accident was never reinvestigated. Buddy Henshaw retired 2 years later, his pension secure, his conscience apparently clear. I lived in my cottage, taught workshops to women in shelters about documentation as resistance, about the power of writing down what the world wants you to forget. The workshop started small, 5 women in a church basement, then 10, then 20. I taught them my calendar code adapted for their own lives. C for control, V for violence, S for survival, L for liberation. I taught them that the opposite of silence wasn't shouting, it was record-keeping. It was the daily act of saying this happened in a world that wanted them to believe they were crazy, that their pain was imaginary, that their memories were unreliable. Some of the women were running from husbands, some from fathers, some from bosses, from pastors, from systems too large to name but too present to escape. They came with bruises and stories and the particular exhaustion of people who'd been fighting alone for too long. I gave them pens. I gave them calendars. I gave them the language to name what had been done to them and the permission to write it down. Maya moved to Austin, took a job with a cybersecurity firm that valued her skills, and asked no questions about her past. She visited every Sunday with coffee and updates on the archive's health, server statuses, encryption keys, the weekly check-ins that kept our mutual insurance policy alive. We developed a routine: coffee on the porch, discussion of the week's threats and victories, dinner, sometimes a movie, something light, something that had nothing to do with our shared history. We never called each other mother and daughter. That would have been too simple, too easy, a narrative that neither of us had earned. We were something else: survivors, collaborators, the architects of a monument built from pain. We were family in the only way that mattered. We chose each other every day without obligation or expectation. I died at 52. Ovarian cancer, the same diagnosis I'd received at 40, that Clayton had made me hide because a senator can't have a sick wife. I'd felt the symptoms for years: the pain that came and went, the bleeding that wasn't normal, the fatigue that I attributed to depression because that was easier than admitting my body was failing. By the time I saw a doctor, a real doctor, not the one Clayton paid to tell me I was fine, it was stage 4. Inoperable, inevitable. Maya was there at the end, holding my hand. The cottage was full of lilies, white ones, the kind Clayton had sent to Patricia's funeral without understanding their meaning. Maya had planted them in the garden, brought them inside, filled the rooms with their scent. It smelled like Louisiana. It smelled like my grandmother's porch. It smelled like the only safe place I'd ever known, and I was grateful. She held the calendar from the year I finally felt free, the first year after Clayton's death, when the letters changed from codes of survival to notes of a life being rebuilt. Garden planted. Workshop held. Maya visited. Coffee on porch. The small entries of a woman learning to be visible one day at a time. The last entry in her handwriting, not mine. Iris stopped confirming. Archive transferred. She is not invisible. I'm Iris. I'm the woman who killed her husband with a calendar and a route on a hunting lease, who spent 20 years writing down what no one wanted to see, who learned that the opposite of silence is not shouting, it's documentation. It's showing up, every day, with a pen and a code, and the refusal to let your own life be erased. If someone ever made you write down your own pain to prove it happened, or if you're still keeping a calendar no one else will ever read, drop a calendar below. I read every comment, and if this story made you want to start documenting what the world wants you to forget, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. What are you finally ready to write down? Backhand index pointing down.